The professor, as political champion, first is aligned with the journalist protagonist that he sends forth to tell the truth, which in turn embodies the witnessing function of the novel, which brings us to an author who would write such a book, and then finally to a critic who, drawing all these figures together, speaks the biocentric, pro-earth truth to power, echoing the original eloquence of the professor. The difficulty with a reading like that is that it doesn't take seriously the novel's textual ambiguities, beginning with the professor's own implication in the escalating violence. Right? The local villagers of the Delta, we are told, quote, fear the militants more than the army. Perhaps because of the professor's especially deadly combination of guns and righteous rhetoric. And another quote, he loves the media, he loves talking about his war for the environment. In at least this one respect, the professor might be compared not to the famous Nigerian activist Ken Saro-Wiwa and his nonviolent campaign, but to Royal Dutch Shell itself, which, like the professor, talks about the environment while toting its guns. On the one hand, Shell continues to buy off Nigerian politicians, back the military, and hire mercenaries to fight those who would disrupt its pipelines. But on the other, it publishes for a global audience greenwashing reports, such as the 2001 volume People, Planets, Profits, which, using good eco-critical language, explains to its readers why it is important to, quote, meet our economic, environmental, and social responsibilities so as to create value for the future, end quote. Now, you want to be very careful. I would not want to avoid any simple comparison of the corporation's imposition of a regime of neocolonial violence with the acts of violent resistance that calls into being. But the point I'm trying to draw out here is that the remediated discourse of environmental advocacy can become not only a form of hypocrisy, but can also become a screen for killing. It's probably no coincidence that Habila, who is himself a professor of creative writing at George Mason University in Virginia, chose in Oil and Water to cast the rebel environmentalist in the image of an eco-critical professor who espouses the environmental truth without acknowledging his language's complicity with the existing political ecology of petroviolence. Again, it's not that people are not driven to violence for good reason, but rather that an eco-criticism with genuinely remediative intentions has to have a critical relationship to such violence, since it is inextricable from the local political environment that the global system of hydrocarbon capitalism has created. To this end, it's worth noting one other striking quality of Habila's novel: its treatment of petroleum not simply as a toxin that has poisoned its surroundings, the proverbial devil's excrement, but as itself a new and persistent feature of the environment. In other words, oil now is the environment. At one point on a cot that sits inside a structure open to the elements, that's a passage, Rufus observes that, quote, not far away in the swamps we could hear bullfrogs bellowing, we could see the glow of gas flares like distant malfunctioning stars, end quote. So even if this is a broken environment, the gas flares here are joining the bullfrogs as a kind of quasi-natural landscape, as a setting. As conveyed in the title of Habila's novel, it is oil on water, an overlaying of one environment on top of, and quite literally overcoming, another. Habila's novel does not so much ask us to contemplate the ruining of the Niger Delta's natural environment per se, as it encourages our reflection on the new conditions of life in a sickened environment that the extraction of petroleum has created, an environment that leads some people to take money from foreign companies in exchange for their cooperation, others to steal oil from pipes or to flee burning villages, and still others to take up arms as soldiers or as rebels. It's trying to draw that sort of larger picture, and I think that's why it's important not to fixate on a sort of, a kind of protagonist that we can identify with, but rather to sort of try to see how the novel unpacks the environment through its work on setting. We might say that the petro-environment on which the extractive oil economy depends, and whose remediation would require the conception of another political ecology altogether, one that's no longer organized in the service of a global fossil fuel regime of accumulation. That's what the novel, in a sense, kind of invites us to entertain. It's surely no coincidence that the main character of Oil on Water is a journalist, a young man who idolized his elder journalist, and who still aspires to remedy the national affliction through the mediation of his writings. He's hoping to make a difference as a journalist. What he discovers, of course, is the complex political minefield of the journalistic process, the capacity of the media to conceal as well as to reveal, the attempts by both the government and the rebels to exploit his journalistic efforts on behalf of their own agendas. Although the novel ends with a moment of spiritual uplift and the healing promise in an animist temple in the midst of the Delta, Oil on Water concludes with no particular journalistic result, no mediational strategy for representing the environmental condition in a politically efficacious way, unless it's the novel itself through its reflections on the uncertainties of how writing could ever help to remediate the Niger Delta. This might be a way of saying that Habilla's novel is not pleading for a biocentric perspective, even if it longs for one. It wishes that embracing a biocentric perspective would be enough to make the Niger Delta a better place. Nor indeed does it advocate any emphatically partisan perspective at all, which perhaps is a purpose of, a reason for critique, but I think allows a certain kind of space for this kind of reflection. Rather, through the conceit of the journey, it attempts to map the structural conditions of violence associated with the existing political ecology of Nigeria in the age of oil. And so too, of course, does the hoax text of the CSRD, if in a rather different register. The kind of eco-critical judgment that the juxtaposition of these two texts demands is in fact the kind that I would argue is already available in our best literary criticism of Nigeria, written by scholars such as Jennifer Wenzel and Sarah Lincoln, who analyze how the forms and strategies of literature are both determined by and responsive to the Nigerian petro-environment in all its aspects. And this applies not only to the poison milieu of the Delta, but all of the other circuits that's associated there, such as, for example, the hallucinatory influences of the petrodollars in Nigeria as they flow in and out, as there's a bubble and there's a bust in the oil market over the course of the decade since independence, and how that interacts with the environmental despoliation. If this is a mode of eco-criticism whose critical sophistication might lead to a vision of meaningful remediation, one that embraces the positive side of the Pharmikon, it does so by recognizing the need for a holistic medicine, one whose responsiveness to the big picture would maintain a vigilant wariness about elixirs that promise an escape from a brush with death, only to miss in the process some fresh round of toxicity. Thanks.
Take questions. I'll try to recognize hands, and we will have a reception afterwards, but we have 20 minutes or so, certainly, for questions, discussion.
Yeah.
Me?
Sure.
Okay. You talk a lot, when you talk about the hoax, about corporate remediation, right? And I'm wondering if in the context of your overall project, you are going to be considering government-led remediation in terms of like the Superfund sites, and how that discourse would be a parallel one or be a different one.
Well, that's a very interesting question. Yeah. I mean, I think, that's a very interesting question. The first thing to observe is that, kind of governmental-based remediation is something that requires a strong state. So in fact, you could say it's something that's been eroding kind of as, sort of a real kind of force to be reckoned with. Now, I think, government-based remediation is probably different. And, its motivation is somewhat different. I think it's more continuous with what you might call Fordist, kind of Fordist era relationship to kind of social goods, right? So what I mean by that is, the sort of the Keynesian kind of Fordist moment, that maybe you could argue began with the reform movements that were also about environmental degradation, right, in certain ways in the 1880s and 1890s, right through, say, the 1970s. Sort of understood the role of the state to be one that remediates kind of the damage caused by, sort of an unregulated marketplace, right? And so the general understanding of that structure is you have you have the state functioning in the role of what I was calling medium, right? Sort of the medium that sort of works back and forth between people and corporations and sort of manages the relationship in such a way as to kind of minimize damage. Now, the problem is that we've kind of moved into a stage where the expectation is that that corporations should clean up their own mess, in a sense. It's not that you wouldn't want, at a certain level, kind of emotionally or out of a sense of justice, corporations to clean their own mess. But the problem is, why would you expect that a corporation would in fact clean its own mess and do a good job? Don't you think the corporation would in fact want to just clean as much as is absolutely necessary in order to be able to carry on business as usual? So you've got yourself into a kind of that would be sort of distinctive of the neoliberal moment. The neoliberal moment is one where you understand the market, the understanding is that the market can solve its own problems, that corporations can clean up their own messes, that maybe the role of government is sort of there to some extent to ensure that they do that. That much is still acknowledged, right? That the US government needs to put pressure on British Petroleum to make sure they clean the Gulf of Mexico. But the idea that the Gulf of Mexico will be cleaned by BP and that we must, that we'll trust that BP, quote, restores them, that's sort of, I think, sort of taken for granted. But that's kind of the direction that we've moved. And so, yeah, to answer your question, I think that's a kind of a fading scenario, and one that I would be thrilled if we could go back to.
You guys go first. I'll go last. Lisa and then Justin.
Thank you. I really liked your talk a lot. But I'm a little troubled by the hoax.
Okay.
Because I want to kind of say that it itself is like a Pharmikon.
Okay.
And that maybe the most frightening thing is that the hoax kind of sort of describes something that's almost perfect, which is that the corporations always can kind of basically take up the discourse of the kind of greening discourse, which you're showing. So in some ways, the corporations already have that hoax folded in their own practices. So they're always sort of already creating a comprehensive shell remediation CRS ND plan that's already kind of always operating. And that's what I think is kind of one of the most sort of frightening things about. And so the activism of that kind of hoax, the irony of it seems to be doing something very different than I think the novel. So I was kind of struck at the end that you're kind of putting them together, and I wondered if you could kind of talk more about action. You didn't quite say how you bring them together, but I think they're kind of working differently.
They're definitely working.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. No, that's a great observation. I guess I appreciate both of them, in some ways, and I'm a little bit troubled, I guess, if you like, by both of them also, for opposite reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's a way of saying I agree with you. After the hoax was revealed, I think the Nigerian Justice League actually said in response to the accusation that, how could you perpetrate such a hoax? Their response was, well, our hoax was not nearly as damaging as Shell's hoax.
Exactly. That's it. Yeah.
But you're right that Shell's hoax is in a sense identical to theirs, right? I mean, Shell, it's just that all they did is they ventriloquized the language that Shell uses all the time, and they said, guess what, it's a joke.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
So the question becomes, what's the political efficacy of doing that, right? I mean, I guess that's the question. And whether you think that whether you think that denaturalizes the corporate discourse in a way that makes people more suspicious and kind of creates more pressure, or whether you think that it just, sort of presupposes a cynicism, right? That is already inescapable. The novel could be accused of not taking sides, of just laying out a kind of trying in a sense to produce a certain kind of a sort of kind of like a cognitive map, to use another Jameson phrase, of kind of, the petrol environment of Nigeria, without actually kind of making clear where one would intervene or even how one would take a position on it. On the other hand, it's extremely insightful into it. Yeah.
Justin, you had a question?
Yeah, I was interested. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful talk. I think there's a lot to talk about. But thinking about this sort of brush with death idea, and how, in retrospect, maybe it looks less like a brush with death, but 2008 looked like sort of a major or capitalism's brush with death, perhaps, right? And sort of the rhetoric of the health of corporations that sort of, becomes so clear after that. And even sort of the notion that corporations are people too, right? And sort of
Anthropomorphizing, however that word is, yeah.
Sort of this a certain type of humanism, like Dow Chemical, the human element, or sort of. So I wonder what's going on here with that rhetoric of sort of expanding or enfranchising corporations under the banner of the human and maybe individuality, and at the same time, sort of the use of neoliberalism to take accidents, right, and make them make individuals, with low human capital, whoever screwed up, right, they're ultimately responsible. We may come in and remediate to help, but in some ways, so this was sort of denying the sickness, their own sickness, and also and accepting it, right? The sympathies that might come along with it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I was sort of curious how you sort of map the question of the human within this.
That's
within the sort of corporations or people, or the human health of corporations, or the health of corporations, as I know.
Right.
Yeah. Is it a type of humanism, or is it just health in general, some sort of vitality per se?
That's a fantastic question, because there's an impulse in let's call it in Foucault's way of thinking about biopolitics that is assiduously kind of like anti-humanist, right? That health becomes simply a kind of matter of sort of like prediction about kind of like rates of survival, sort of degrees of endemic and epidemic phenomena, things like things that are like just where we experience that, like when we go to the hospital and suddenly we it's like a very non-human environment. But of course, health is profoundly kind of a critical element in kind of what we ordinarily understand to be humanity, right? And I mean by that in the sort of sense that when someone gets sick in my workplace, I tell them, I'm sorry you're sick, can I help you? Is there anything I can do? It's sort of this moment where there's a notion of pitching in, and a notion there's a kind of an ethical component that kind of kicks in around the human in the context of health. Now, I think in this talk, there's a subtext that I have not fleshed out, but that I would like to flesh out. I just didn't have the time to do it here. That would sort of take up the question of the ethical, right? Because I think it's not insignificant that the remediation effort. A remediation effort is not simply a form of medicine; it's also a kind of ethical act, right? There's an ethics to remediation. You hurt somebody. It's time for restitution. So it's not just remedy, but it's also kind of fulfilling one's debts, if you like, one's wrongs, making up for one's wrongs. Understood in that way, suddenly this whole other side of the remediation effort opens up, right? I mean, you could say that what the prank is up to is acknowledging the sort of the vast debt that Shell owes to the people and to the land of Nigeria in exchange for what it's done. And in fact, so much so that it could never pay back the people or the land what it has done to them. So at that moment, you say, yeah, the corporation has been kind of implicitly anthropomorphized and has been sort of produced as a moral subject who has an obligation. And then this kind of discourse of remediation is at some level acknowledging that and trying to work around it. It's trying to navigate an expectation of moral behavior by corporations. Right? If that's the case, then there is definitely a kind of a humanist element that's kind of at work here. And it would be very important to figure out how the humanist and the anti-humanist elements here are actually woven together in some extremely complicated way that's not fully acknowledged.
Okay, then you, and then Hylos.
I just want to add something to this equation in talking about the nature of the corporation here, because when the Yes Men did this prank, originally with Dow Chemical acknowledging responsibility for the Bhopal disaster, I know you know this one. The thing that, it wasn't just irony, and it wasn't just they took the complete aping of the language of remediation. The thing that was different about that was they said, we're going to give all our money to these people. We're not going to pay any attention to the bottom line. You know, basically saying this, and that's when the alarm bells are going off. Like if you're paying attention,
Right.
This can't be a corporation talking, because the nature of the corporation is as a sort of anthropomorphized entity. Like its money, its fiscal health is the only thing that it can possibly care about.
Yeah.
By definition, right? So that's when you sort of know so I think it's more than the irony. It's that the way in which the prank versions just immediately went to the bottom line and saw it for what it was, and said the opposite of what a corporation could ever say.
Yeah. The Yes Men Dow Chemical action, I think actually is different than this one. That's kind of an interesting kind of insight. Because this one by Nigerian Justice League was pretty careful to make it plausible. You know, they laid out a sort of a form of reparation that would never actually happen, but they couched it in the language of sort of like what's good for the corporation, and sort of like I kind of talked about forestalling the threat to them by what's happening to BP and not wanting to kind of fall victim to it too. So it was much more believable, you know, in that sense. But you could well ask which strategy is actually more effective. One that, you know, goes to the point where you would say no corporation could possibly say that, what's going on, to the one where you say, oh, that's amazing, I had no idea they were going to do that, that's fantastic. And then afterwards you're like, oh my God.
Well, investors seem to believe the first person who
Vicky?
Mine was just a quick comment in relation to Justin's point about possibilities of the humanist discourse in relation to corporations, and the idea of the multivalency of that, because we can think about how corporations might therefore become moral subjects in some way or other, but equally they could also be flawed, and we can see them as flawed, and we can forgive them for their flaws.
Sure.
Right? So that kind of humanist discourse is also part of how we're encouraged to think about corporations as just being people too. People too.
Well, you make mistakes as well.
That kind of thing.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Like, you know, we should have been more careful. We were not.
We're sorry.
Yeah.
We're sorry. We'll do everything we can now to make it up. Yeah. No, that's right. That's definitely active.
I just had a very quick question about, a little confusion about your use of Brusin's concept and Bolton's concept of remediation,
Yes.
which is about technologies, and which is about, you know, sort of Independence Day in some way before the Holocaust, the 9/11 happened, already anticipating it. That's how they're using it. So I was confused how technology was working in your argument. Maybe I missed something. I was distracted halfway through.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe we need to just kind of talk through how we understand their use of remediation. But I take it to mean quite literally a sort of a kind of a process of translation, if you like, that takes place. Yes, it's typically technologically mediated, or we could even say that mediation requires a technological apparatus of some kind, whatever it can be, technology of writing, you could say technology of image making, but that what they're interested in is what happens when you try to, in a sense, kind of accomplish that translation. You try to remediate, you try to constitute a new version of something old in a way, like, one example they'll use is, they have a range of different uses, but that you create comfort level with, visual technologies of writing by mimicking the book. That's one thing they'll talk about. For example, that the ebook is sort of meant to sort of resemble the book in such a way that even, say, someone who is kind of tends to be technophobic will say, okay, I guess this does look a bit like a book, and I guess I can kind of turn the page, although it works a little differently. And so it's a form of acclimation to technological change. Remediation is a kind of strategy for that acclimation process. So I guess I'm trying to explore the question of whether environmental remediation has a similar kind of operation involved. And the operation is, essentially that we're being asked to acclimate ourselves to a world after this disaster has happened. And the way that we do that is by producing something that, in a sense, kind of mimics that which preceded it in such a way that we can make our peace with it and kind of move forward. And that would be a kind of a sort of a, its own kind of technology.
Okay,
Yeah.
That's an interesting twist, on the gruesome.
Okay.
Have time for one more question?
Great, well, thank you
why
very
don't we-
much.